let's keep reading. Post-tribulationism. This view puts the rapture at the farthest end of the 7 years. I'll just tell you right up front in case you're not following along with the terms pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, etc. But post-trib, post meaning after the tribulation. So this perspective, I went on to say that there are a number of views in the post-trib camp. They're all kind of little bit of kind of hybrids of the post-trib camp, or they're variations on the same perspective of post-trib. They don't all have the exact same timing, but they're all kind of clustered into this category that I've labeled post-trib. Some post-tribbers see the church in tribulation since its beginnings. In other words, they don't see the 7-year period as futuristic. They just kind of have everything kind of as a historicist view, I think, where we've been in the tribulation for the last 2,000 years, basically. And so the things that Yeshua talked about in Matthew 25 that we would call the birth pangs, or the initial things that are happening in the world, the wars and rumors of wars, the famines, the plagues, the all kinds of earthquakes and things like that. That's been going on ever since the church age began 2,000 years ago at Pentecost. That's kind of what I mean by a historicist perspective. So they don't look at the last 7 years really as something that's happening in the future, but they do look at the second coming of Christ as the culmination of the end of the age that must take place to usher in that millennial kingdom that we keep talking about, that's on many of these charts, the far right side of most of the charts. Let's keep reading. The most prevalent view today of the post-tribulations is that the 7-year period is yet in the future, right? It is a real 7-year period. And so in other words, it's not just strung out along lines of 2,000 years. Rather, there really is a 7th week of Daniel in the most prevalent post-trib perspective. And although the church will experience this time of tribulation, here's the kind of Goshen principle or greater exodus that I've been talking about that's very popular with Messianics these days. Although the church will experience this time of tribulation, I go on to say that it will be sheltered by God's protection before the second coming. So similar to what happened in the first Exodus with the children of Israel. God didn't rapture them out of Egypt until all the plagues had been finished running their course. Israel had to be there for all of the plagues. In other words, all the bad stuff had to come down also. It's just that God supernaturally sheltered them while in place. And that's one of the more prevalent views of the post-tribulationist perspective, is that we're not going to be raptured away. Instead, God's going to protect us throughout the whole thing. And therefore, when it's time to bring in the kingdom, we might make a quick jump up and then but straight back down, a little quick U-turn, because they still can't deny the fact that there's going to be some resurrection. I mean, that's biblical. You can't rip that out of your eschatology end-time perspective, or you're going to run into massive problems, not just from the New Testament, but from the Old Testament, right? Resurrection is an established event that must be recognized by both students of the Tanakh as well as students of the Apostolic Scriptures. You've got to recognize resurrection. Even if you don't like that other ugly R word known as rapture, you got to recognize the really cool R word known as resurrection. So, sheltered in place, protected by God before the second coming. George Ladd in his book, The Blessed Hope, and Robert Gundry in his book, The Church and the Tribulation, they both teach that the church will experience the 7-year period, which will conclude with the rapture of the church. So again, here's what the chart looks like, post-trib chart. Here you got the 7-year slice, and this time it's all labeled God's wrath. So tribulation is the first half, the first 3.5 years, but great tribulation is the second half, but all of it, the entire 7 years, is God's wrath being poured out. And Christians, if you notice, go through the entire 7 years of tribulation/wrath. And then the two arrows, black and white, kiss one another at the far right of the screen, where second coming meets with post-trib rapture. So it's a quick up into the air, get your white robes, come back down, and let's do business, right? That's kind of what takes place. I'm being kind of humorous with it, but you guys are following along. All right, let's keep going. I think I will finish this part of my study tonight because we're right at about the hour mark. So this last view is the view that I'm going to champion, the one that I'm going to hold to, that I think has the most biblical traction when you harmonize all of the views and all of the major events that are in the end time scenarios, and you take it from a literal face value hermeneutic that allows for a sequence of events to be portrayed and foretold in the Bible, understood from their normative sense of the way sequence words and chronology is given in biblical prophecy. We end up with the view known as the pre-wrath view. And the spelling of the word, of the name of the position, sometimes you'll see it as a capital P, lowercase R-E dash, lowercase W-R-A-T-H, like you see on your screen now. Sometimes it shows up as capital P and then all the letters are put together without a dash, just pre and then the word P and then the capital P and then the rest of the letters lower with no dash. Sometimes the W is capitalized. Sometimes it's two words, pre and then space, capital W. But I'm not consistent in my own. I tried to be consistent, but since I started this study 25 years ago and I'm picking up now, I think I might have changed along the way. So if you see the spelling change a few times, I apologize. And different authors are going to represent it different ways. So the pre-wrath position, I go on to say, teaches that the true church will be raptured when the Great Tribulation by Antichrist, inspired by Satan himself, is cut short by God's day of the Lord wrath, which will occur when? Between the 6th and 7th seals of Revelation, sometime during when? The second half of the 70th week. So again, we're not date setting. We still honor the idea that Jesus said in Matthew, no man knows the day or the hour. We don't know exactly when the rapture is going to happen, but we have this idea of when the season of the rapture should happen based on Yeshua's portrayal of the signs and of the birth pangs and of the sequence of events that he says, then this will happen, then this will happen, and then we see this happen, then after this happens, and that perfectly parallels parallels not only Paul's letters in the Corinthians and the Thessalonians that we looked at earlier, but it finally culminates in John's letter to John's book called The Revelation that was given to him by Yeshua when he was on exile on Patmos. And there we finally given sequential sets of 7 events, like the 7 seals followed by the 7 trumpets followed by the 7 bowls, or some people think they all happen concurrently, simultaneously at the same time, meaning the 7 seals happen at the same time as the 7 trumpets and at the same time as the 7 bowls. But we'll get to that in time. But either way, the pre-wrath comes along and says, if you put all of this together and give it a normative, chronological, sequential, face value hermeneutic where we're dealing with real people groups such as the church or Israel or Antichrist or persons, and you're dealing with real historical events that are played out in real time, albeit in supernatural brilliance, right? We're talking about a return of the supernatural on planet Earth. I mean, signs and wonders are going to be happening all around us, and that you're not just dealing with symbolic language, but just like the plagues of old. I mean, if you want to learn about the end of the book, you got to study the beginning of the book. And I firmly espouse to the idea that the best way to understand the end times is to understand what took place in the original Exodus. Yes, so I mean, I'm not throwing a greater Exodus out and under the bus, even though it's a view championed by Monty Judah, a very somewhat controversial Messianic teacher. But I do agree that pre-wrath is able to articulate its perspective in a very cohesive way, a very persuasive manner. So that's why I'm going to present it, but also because I believe it has the most biblical, what's the word I'm looking for? Biblical accuracy. So I go on to say that, and we're wrapping up here. The persecution associated with the Great Tribulation of Antichrist is viewed not as tribulation, but as the wrath of Satan, whereas by comparison, the events that follow, beginning with the 7th seal, are considered what we would call the wrath of God. And this is going to be a foundational aspect which not only separates this view from many of the other views, but also is one of the strongest points to understanding this perspective. It is a pillar in this particular perspective that the tribulation is not the wrath of God. There's a distinguishing aspect between them. So when we look at the chart that we saw earlier, we've got this pre-wrath rapture, And we've got the 7-year slice of history known as Daniel's 70th week. And I'm not going to call it the 7-year tribulation because I think that's a non-biblical viewpoint, a non-biblical terminology, a label. Instead, we're going to call it Daniel's 70th week. But within the 7 years, we can break it down between the first 3.5, like we've done with all the other charts. And we're going to label it the beginning of sorrows as the first 3.5. Remember, Antichrist signs the covenant at the beginning of every one of these 7-year charts. So that's something that's unmovable, and that's something that's not disputed. But we also have the abomination of desolation taking place at the midpoint, which is also not in dispute by most, if not all, end time teachers and students that are in this particular discussion. But then right after the midpoint, we have the beginning of what's called the Great Tribulation, which should run the entire 3.5 years. But instead, it's going to be cut short by the event that is called the pre-wrath rapture, where we got the white arrow pointing up, and then the God's wrath, which is the part of the black arrow pointing down, the day of the Lord, which occupies the final quarter, as it were, of this 7-year slice of 3.5 years. God's wrath is just that last section. How long God's wrath is, I'm not saying. This is just a general chart here that you're looking at. We're not saying, we pre-wrathers are not saying that the last 3.5 years is definitely cut into whatever 3.5 years divided by half is, right? That's not what we're saying. It's just a generalization. We don't really know when the rapture is going to take place. We don't know when God's wrath is going to be poured out. We're simply saying that the events are going to happen. They're going to be triggered simultaneously. And that event, the rapture / pouring out of God's wrath, is going to cut short the Great Tribulation and initiate the Day of the Lord, which is a well-known event spoken about way back in the Old Testament. The Day of the Lord occupies a lot of Bible time, so get familiar with it. And then lastly, at the far right of this chart, just like all of the other charts I've shown you, the second coming is when Jesus comes back, not for his saints, but with his saints, right? It's the horse riding part that we read about in the book of Revelation. Jesus comes back on a white horse. We're coming with him. But then we still have to make sense of, where does Israel fit into this picture? Did Israel get raptured? Did Israel get left behind, like Tim LaHaye says in his series? Did Israel go through the Great Tribulation? Did Israel go through the Day of the Lord? What is Israel's role? This is going to be a primary focus of this study as well. So I hope you don't tune me out and just think, well, this is just for the church. No, we've got to figure out why we are even here as Christians, to minister to Israel, to pray for them, to support them, and what is going to happen to those Jews who don't believe in Jesus, but are here on planet Earth when all of this stuff is going down. We're going to have to deal with that. So I think Brother Aaron Eggman's study is going to be very helpful in that regard. So that's going to do it for the charts for pre-wrath. Let me close by reading these last two paragraphs, and then we'll draw our study to a close. There's another term that I say that it's sometimes expressed, known as historical premillennialism, which, as far as I can tell, refers back to the teaching of the early church fathers before 325 AD. So notice, we've got pre-trib, which is a fairly recent term that came about when John Darby introduced his theology, along with dispensationalism. Then we had the mid-trib that came along a little later after that, and then the post-trib that perhaps maybe is also a little later than that. And then we've got this pre-wrath, which the term is also new, but what about the concept of the church going through tribulation, facing the Antichrist and the man of lawlessness, and then being rescued by God at the end during either a rapture or a second coming or simultaneous event? How old is that view? Well, as far as I can tell, it's very old. It goes back to the view known as, or the label, historical premillennialism, going all the way back to 325 AD. And what I found is that the early church fathers believed that the church would face the persecution of Antichrist, and that Christ would then reign for 1,000 years upon the earth. So it's a very simplified overview of the end time events in Daniel's 70th week, but notice, by contrast to the pre-trib view, which says that the church is going to be snatched out of the way and out of harm's way before any tribulation hits, and therefore the church is not going to even face the Antichrist, the historical premill version or label which is in harmony with pre-trib, by the way, actually says, no, the church must face persecution from Antichrist, but that Christ is going to establish his kingdom, which means Antichrist must be defeated. And whether we're calling that defeat the rapture or the second coming, we don't have any distinguishing label yet. But I go on to say that with the exception of two church fathers, namely Origen and Clement of Alexandria, they were allegorists. All of the church fathers basically taught the view, as far as I can tell, the view of historical pre-mill, which, as I go on to say, pre-wrath is plainly and simply an expansion of this view, which was biblical then and has been proven to be biblical still. So are you understanding where I'm going with this? This is why, again, I believe that it's so unfortunate that we've got so much confusion, people abandoning rapture altogether. No, don't abandon rapture, but don't be confused as to what the Bible is teaching concerning this end time. We should embrace what's known as resurrection and the blessed hope. We should embrace what's taught as the second coming of Christ. Absolutely. But we should also understand that God promises not just to rescue us from harm's way, either in the form of taking us out of the way first or in the form of protecting us in the midst of danger. Either one is a rescue, preventing us from having to go through what we're going to label the wrath of God. But either way, not only are we not destined to face the wrath of God, but we're also need to understand that as Christians, we have an important role to play when it comes to bringing Israel to a place where she can cry out, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Remember, Yeshua said, you won't see me again until you cry this cry, right? Matthew chapter 23. Just before he gave the Olivet Discourse, he tells Israel, hey, I'm leaving. I'm going to leave your house to you desolate because you guys have rejected me. And you're not going to see me again until you have this messianic cry. And so the church has an important role to play. We're not just going to be up and out of here and then leave poor Israel behind to face all the bad stuff that's going to happen. That's a wrong-headed notion, people. We're grafted into Israel, and this is very important for us to understand the role that we're going to play in helping to bring Israel to a knowledge and acceptance of her Messiah in the end times. So we've got to be around long enough to be a proper witness. We've got to be around long enough to bring Israel to a jealousy. And so we also have to realize that God is orchestrating all of these events not to destroy Israel, but to prepare her for meeting her Messiah and ushering in that glorious kingdom that he promised to give Israel a long time ago. Right? There are promises that are still unfulfilled, and God keeps his word. So that's the view that we're going to be working our way towards, and that's why pre-wrath is a very important perspective, because it actually has the gall and the chutzpah to take a stand against the errors of dispensationalism. John Darby's dispensationalism, which goes part and parcel with the pre-trib view, is the part that is so kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of repulsive to many messianics. They're like, what? God has given up on Israel? Rejected his people, and he's dealing with this new dispensation known as the Christian church, and there's no place for Israel anymore, and all of that, right? Dispensationalism has a checkered history, especially among many messianics. So it's kind of no wonder that when the pre-trib became popular, the pre-trib view, dispensationalism also rose in prominence. And so when we're talking about pre-wrath, there's a lot about dispensationalism that we have to also challenge. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this particular perspective. And then lastly, this last paragraph that I say in this intro version, this overview, and then we'll close the study down tonight, is as we're going to quickly find out, these are my own thoughts. The pre-wrath rapture view is not for the faint of heart who, quote unquote, feel that the church shouldn't go through any tribulation. Why? Because the Bible actually teaches in numerous references quite the opposite. So this idea of, I don't have to really be ready to go through anything. I'm just going to wait for Jesus to come, take me away, rescue me. That whole mindset has multiple problems in and of itself. And the solution, listen please carefully, the solution is not to throw out rapture. The solution is not to abandon the idea that God is going to rescue us. No, the idea is to simply turn back into the Bible and embrace the truth of the idea that God is going to rescue / protect us during this time. And if it comes down to having to yank us out of harm's way before Antichrist would just wipe us all out, well, then God can and will do that. Eventually, God did take Israel out of Egypt before Egypt was completely ruined. The Pharaoh got to the point where he was just crazy. And no matter the plagues, even after he let Israel go, he pursued them. And so God had to supernaturally protect Israel from the Pharaoh at some point in time by, as we know, we've read the story, or we've watched the animations, right? Prince of Egypt, or one of those other shows, right, of God, Exodus of Gods and Men, or something like that. God had to bring them through the Red Sea to finally sever the tie between the wicked kingdom that Pharaoh represented, which is Satan's kingdom there in this representation, and God's kingdom and God's people known as Israel. Well, eventually that's what God's going to have to do, because Satan is going to go buck wild after Israel, after the church, and seek to annihilate us, right? It's going to be a genocide again. He's going to seek to wipe out the people of Israel and to wipe out the Christians who are here on earth. So if God didn't either A, rapture us as Christians, and or B, supernaturally protect Israel during this time, and I'm talking about unsaved Israel now, right? They're still his covenant people. If he didn't do that, then there would be no more Israel and there would be no more Christian church, because Satan would have had his way and wiped us all out. So God has to intervene. So it's necessary for us to teach some form of God demonstrating not just his protective power where he can rescue us / protect us, but at the same time, God has to demonstrate judgment. And that's why wrath has to fall. Wrath has to fall not just on an unrepentant world, but it has to fall on an evil antichrist and false prophet and the devil himself. They all have to be judged. So I say in closing, indeed, many believers, and this is sad but true, they are truly hoping to be raptured out prior to anything bad happening. And don't get me wrong, I hope I'm wrong. Yeah, what if pre-wrath is wrong? What if pre-trib is right? What if Jesus does come and we don't see anything bad? Well, hallelujah, that would be great. Yeah, let's look forward to Jesus rescuing us from any bad things happening, right? I don't want to see the Antichrist either. I don't want to be faced with having to take the mark. I don't want to be faced with having to have my head chopped off. I don't want that. But what if the pre-tribbers are wrong? Are you prepared to go through that? Is your faith strong enough to stand the tribulation? Right? Let's talk about that. So I go on to say that I'm afraid for many Christians that this type of rapture would mean a feet first rapture. Why? Because they're still holding on to the world's affections. The church just isn't ready, right? The church just isn't ready in terms of so much compromise, so much wishy-washy, one foot in the world and one foot in the church. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. God has to purge us and purify us and prepare us to meet our husband who's going to come one day soon. And so I also go on to say that for the rest of us, this still poses a problem to our hearts in that we can't be smug. We must continually re-examine our priorities in the light of all truth, doing what? Testing ourselves. Read 2 Corinthians 13:5. And testing our theologies. Read Acts 17:11. So the point I'm trying to close in is saying, I'm not saying that we pre-wrathers need to be smug, proud, haughty, high-minded, headstrong, and say, we've got all the answers, we figured it out. Those poor, stupid, silly pre-tribbers, they don't have a clue. They're in for a rude awakening. No, that's the wrong position to take also. All of us need to examine our hearts, examine our priorities. We need to test ourselves, and we need to test our theologies, because we all have parts where we don't understand. So we need one another. So I'm saying that I'm doing a study like this so that we can come together and talk the issues out and come to a shared understanding, because we're in this together. And I don't just mean we Christians are in this together. I mean, we Christians and Jews are in this together, because guess what? And I really will close with this. When the Antichrist turns at the midpoint of the week, that's when I figure he's going to be revealed to the world for who he truly is. The mask comes off and he turns from being this man of peace to this man of absolute sheer terror. When that happens, he's going to go after Jews and Christians. He will go after anyone who opposes him. And at some point, he's going to turn on all religions, as far as I can tell. First, he's going to try and synthesize it, and when that doesn't work, he's just going to try and turn on it altogether. But he will have, as far as I can tell, an intense hatred, right? Read Revelation chapter 12. This intense hatred for not just Israel, but for Christians. So he's coming after both of us. Guess what? We need each other. We Christians and Jews. We need to stand together and begin to put a lot of our differences aside and learn to understand how that God has brought us together in this great olive tree known as Israel, where not just national Israel has to deal with the Christian church, but the remnant of Israel needs to see that they've got their brothers on both sides of the aisle. They've got national Israel on one side, who is unsaved Israel, and they've got the Christian Gentile churches on the other side who don't quite understand how Israel fits in the picture. So we've got to have this proper perspective so that we can all help each other out during these very difficult times that are going to befall us. Amen? Amen. That'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.